What's up, Yinzers, Yinzettes? Welcome back to yet another edition of Puck Snap. We're going to give you the latest downtime breakdowns and everything from this past week in Penguins hockey. As you can see, I am joined by a very special guest today, Patrick Damp from the Locked On podcast. Welcome on, Pat. Thanks for joining me today.
Kelsey, thanks for having me. We've been doing a lot of collabs lately, but it's nice to finally be a part of your show because it feels like Hunter and I over on Locked On Penguins kind of lean on you a little too much. So it was probably about time one of us repays the favor.
Well, I really appreciate it. I mean, as you probably, and as all the listeners probably know at this point, I'm running this solo for a little bit, so I appreciate all the help I can get on here. Yeah, so we're just going to jump right in. We're going to break format a little bit this week. We typically do the week in review, trending up, trending down. But first of all, just with Pat on, I'd like this to be kind of a more discussion, focused show. But we do want to lead with some really tragic news that just broke early this afternoon, and that's the passing of former Penguins GM Ray Shero. Honestly, this is, I think, a shock to everybody. The news was broken, like I said earlier, this afternoon, and we just wanted to lead with that because Ray Shero was obviously a really, really big part, of building the Penguins championship teams. Obviously, starting with his first draft in 2006 with Jordan Staal, and onward for the next several years. So, Pat, just want to get your thoughts and just maybe some of your looking back reflections of Ray Shero as part of the Penguins organization.
You can't talk about this era of Penguins hockey without mentioning Ray Shero because obviously your mind goes right to the 2009 Stanley Cup championship, which he was the architect of. He obviously had the fortitude mid-season after his team goes to the 2008 Stanley Cup final and ultimately loses to part ways with Michel Therrien as head coach and bring in Dan Bylsma behind the bench to take over, which was a really risky move in and of itself because Dan Bylsma was not a very experienced head coach at the time. He had only had a little bit of time with the baby Penguins, so tremendous risk bringing him up to the big club, and it pays off in the way of that 2009 Stanley Cup. But even before that, he comes in 2006 after serving as assistant GM to David Poile with the Nashville Predators. It's his first shot at getting the big job as a general manager. And he made quite a difference to the Penguins organization because obviously Crosby and Malkin were here. And well, actually that's kind of a misnomer. Crosby was here. Malkin, it wasn't entirely clear yet if he was going to be a Penguin or if he was going to have to finish his time in Russia. But then he comes over in what is an incredible story. If you've never read how Malkin became a Penguin that season, it's straight out of a spy movie. But you get Gino, you eventually get Staal, and he started to put things in place that took the Penguins from the basement of the league and a bit of a joke of a team and made them real contenders again. It was the Marian Hossa trade in 2008. It was the Gary Roberts trade in 2007 to bring him in and really show everybody that this team is no longer in the basement. This is a team that's going to be a contender, and it's going to be a contender for years to come. And one of the biggest things I credit him with, it's something that Jim Rutherford picked up the ball on, and obviously now Kyle Dubas is continuing to run with, is it's become a trend across the NHL, and Shero was one of the first in the modern era to really grasp this idea. And it's treating your farm clubs the way baseball teams do, where the Penguins, since they got Sidney Crosby, especially with Ray Shero and then Jim Rutherford, and it took a little bit of a back seat under Hextall, it's obviously all the way back with Kyle Dubas, is Wilkes-Barre and Wheeling were not just places for your top talent to develop. They wanted them to be good teams. They wanted them to be incubators for players that you might not think of. When you think of a lot of the guys who post Ray Shero helped win the Stanley Cup in 2016 and 2017, your Jake Gensels, Tom Kuhnhackl, Connor Sherry, and a handful of others, a lot of those guys came through a developmental system. And once Ray Shero and the Penguins understood that with the teams they were putting together, they were never going to get top 5, top 10 first round picks. So they took a lot of chances on projects. So obviously the Stanley Cup in 2009 is Ray Shero's biggest legacy in Pittsburgh, but his longest lasting legacy to me is that he helped the organization pick up a developmental model that has helped them remain competitive, or at least had remained competitive for almost 20 years.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head with the developmental model, because you see teams replicating that all across the league too. It wasn't like, I wouldn't say it was a out of nowhere concept, but it wasn't something that NHL clubs were doing, as you said, and you see that more, like you said, akin to baseball now, where they want those teams to be competitive. And we're seeing kind of the fruits of those labors now with the team that the Penguins have this season. So another thing too, just that really I will always kind of remember about Shero is those stories about, Ron Burkle and them having conversations around the time when they decided to start going for it. Because I don't know, how old our listeners are, but if you remember, this rebuild was supposed to take a lot longer than it actually did for the Penguins. I don't think they were expecting to turn the corner so quickly, and be a competitive team, but the roster and the results forced their hand. So they had conversations. Shero had conversations with Burkle, Lemieux, and they said, "Hey, it's there. Let's do this. Like, we're not going to wait around for the perfect window or the timing to be right. Like, the timing's now." And that kind of almost built this winning culture, this culture of consistency that's still prevalent in the Penguins organization. Now, granted, they've missed the playoffs for the past 3 seasons, but they talk about this culture aspect all the time. And that's something that Shero really helped, ingrain in this organization. Because through all the things that you said and all the moves that he made, and also just, that approach to development and everything. So this is just a massive loss on so many levels. Because beyond the Penguins, he did a lot for hockey too. So, can't say enough good things about Ray Shero, and he'll sorely be missed. Is there anything else you want to add as far as just Ray Shero and his legacy?
I do want to kind of build on a little bit what you said about him going to ownership at the time with Lemieux and Burkle. There was a 5-year plan in place for the Penguins when they got Sidney Crosby. They were looking to contend by 2010, 2011. It wasn't supposed to be 2008 and then 2009, but they have a tumultuous first season with Crosby. As expected, not a lot around them. They took risks on guys who were probably over the hill and really not in their prime anymore, which is understandable. And then the very next year, they go on a tear and they look like one of the better teams in the Eastern Conference. And then Ottawa gives them that kind of welcome to the big show moment in the first round and dispatches the Penguins very easily in 5 games. And then obviously 2008 happens and they're making a run at possibly being the top seed in the East. And then they're doing really well. And when Shero goes to the All-Star game in Atlanta, he starts talking to people about who's out there for the trade deadline. And Marian Hossa from Atlanta at the time, the Thrashers, his name was out there. And he says, "Guys, I think we can go get Marian Hossa and we can push this team into contention." And he expected there to be pushback. He expected ownership to say, no, this isn't part of our window. This isn't part of our plan. And they surprised him and said, yeah, go get them. We're going to give you all the resources. If we can win now, let's go win now. Let's strike while the iron's hot. And from then on, the Penguins have been in go for it mode since probably 2008 until 2023.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, we'll talk about this a little later too, but I mean, I think it's even, I'm not saying Ray Shero is the architect of this per se, but we're seeing kind of a shift league wide about, what rebuilds look like. And I'm obviously the Penguins got really lucky by drafting Sidney Crosby, Evgeny Malkin, Jordan Staal, Marc-Andre Fleury, Chris Letang all within 4 drafts. But it's also one of those things you look back on just all the moves that he made and the process. And like you said, and we were talking about him going to ownership and saying, hey, the time's now. You're seeing, a lot more teams adopt this strategy of trying to retool and trying to, go for it and have those shorter windows. Now, for the Penguins, they kind of got lucky because they got that sustained success. They had the core in place. But I just think he did a lot to really, like I said, rope in this winning culture for the organization. And the Penguins have been the standard of consistency and basically a model franchise for almost 2 decades. So again, just a massive, massive loss for the Penguins community. And you're going to be missed, Ray, by everyone. So we just want to jump to the next thing, unless you have anything else to add. You good?
Yeah.
All right. So we just want to talked about kind of how we're going to throw the week in review a little bit in the rear view. But part of the week in review has obviously been the kids, Rutger, McGroarty, and Ville Koivunen. They were recalled last Friday, and they put together a nice string of games here. Now, unfortunately, Rutger McGroarty was injured in last night's game, and we don't know the extent of that injury yet. He did have a boot on after the game. We can speculate to the moon and back. But, Pat, I just want to get your thoughts on what you're seeing so far from these two guys.
There's no deep dive to be had here. There's no deep analysis beyond they're ready. These two kids are NHL ready. And I said it earlier today on our most recent episode of Locked On Penguins. This is a bit of a surprise for me because I said initially when they got called up, you're going to have the sugar rush first game. They're going to come out absolutely flying. There's going to be all kinds of positive momentum and adrenaline behind them. Rutger McGroarty comes back for another stint in the NHL. Ville Koivunen makes his NHL debut. They're going to be shot out of a cannon. We're all going to be excited. We're going to miss every negative thing they do because we're going to be hyper alert for every positive thing they do. But now we get to today, and they've been here for a 5-game stretch. Still a bit of a small sample size, all things considered, but once you get to that 5-game sample size, you can really start to get a better feel for what these kids can and cannot do. And for both of them, it has been, in my estimation, nothing but positive. Ville Koivunen has NHL vision. You have looked at all 5 games. He has made some of the best passes I have seen this season. And I said it on our show, a player his age coming up to the NHL, you're always expecting them to retreat to safety, that they're going to make the high percentage play, whether it's dumping it deep, whether it's making a simple pass, just not taking too many risks. Koivunen's not doing that. You watch these last few games, he has sprung Brian Rust on a breakaway. He's sprung a couple people on a breakaway, had a brilliant assist for Erik Karlsson's 200th career goal on Tuesday night against the Blackhawks. And he's had multiple others that did not turn into goals, but they were tremendous setups. The kid's got great NHL vision. I think he's going to be an asset for the power play for years to come, should he continue to develop. As for McGroarty, night and day for this kid from when he started the season in the NHL and then got sent down to Wilkes-Barre to where he is now. You can tell that the organization was hyper aware. He was hyper aware that he needed to work on his skating, and he has done exactly that. Now, still has to get a bit of a better first step, still probably needs to get a little bit quicker, but he is a much better skater this time around. And at the end of the day, this is what the Penguins need. This is what this organization needs for these next couple of seasons. You're going to need your Rutger McGroartys, your Ville Koivunens, hopefully Tristan Bros, and a couple others continue to develop. And yeah, they're not going to be superstars, so everybody should be a little bit patient and a little bit and temper their expectations a little bit, because these aren't going to be superstars, but they will be hopefully solid NHL contributors who aren't just going to, if I can steal a popular phrase from people, they're not going to be cardio merchants. They're not going to eat 14, 15 minutes a night and not really do anything. They're going to have a positive impact. So for the two of them over the last 5 games, it has been nothing but positive, and I think there is a very bright future in the NHL for both of them.
Yeah, I think you said it really well. And, I think they exceeded my expectations as well. I didn't think I was going to see a lot of the things that I'm seeing from them at this point. And like you said, I mean, Ville Koivunen is just a really smart player. He's also a really creative player. As you said, he's not afraid to take those risks. I love that pass on the Carlson goal yesterday, because he very well could have just taken that shot too. There was a shot open for him, and he saw Carlson over there, threads a perfect pass, like you said, for his 200th goal. And then, as far as McGroarty, I think the thing that stands out to me, now this isn't something that's necessarily quantifiable on a stat sheet, but there are very few players that come in and just, feel like they have it right away, especially with Sidney Crosby. Because, something I observed is just how he reads off of Crosby and how they kind of read off each other. And I think I was actually talking to Hunter the other day, and Hunter said this, and I kind of had this thought as well. His smarts and just the fact that he's never out of position. He's always creating space. He's always, in the exact moment at the exact right time that he needs to be. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Jake Gensel. And I know obviously he doesn't have the finishing ability that Jake Gensel does. As you said, we should, temper our expectations a little bit with these prospects. They're not superstars, but that is just a skill set that really can't be taught, and something that he just has. Like, he just has it. And you saw that on, I forget which game it was, the assist on Crosby's goal, I believe against Dallas, where he was right along the goal line. He made that read right away. That was a quick pass. He knew Crosby was there. He had eyes on the back of his head. And, we've talked to several people throughout the years, and playing with Sid and just coming in and being able to read off him like that isn't the easiest thing to do, but it seems so seamless for him. So, as you said, I mean, the skating stands out for McGroarty, the vision stands out for Koivunen, but I'm just impressed by, all these little details in their game that are already pretty rounded out, that you don't typically see from prospects coming up, right off the jump. So I think that kind of gives them a little bit of a head start on a roster spot next season. And hopefully they can get, that full season of development in at the NHL level next season. But it also kind of gives you hope that, maybe there's a few more of these kinds of guys in the Penguin system, like the Tristan Broses. If you've been paying attention, Tanner Howell's killing it right now down in the WHL playoffs. So, I think there's some of this kind of potential with some of the guys in their system. And it's nice to see, 2 of them kind of showing that right off the bat.
This is something, it's my hobby horse, I guess, is the best way for me to describe it. Is I say this about players on Locked On all the time. I have said it whether when I was at Penn's blog or when I was writing a column for KDKA on various different podcasts I've been on over the years. There is something that Rutger McGroarty has that I think doesn't get talked about enough, and you hinted at this. Being able to play with elite players is a skill within itself, because we have talked about it already on this show when we talked about our little memorial for Ray Shero. We saw so many players come and go during the Crosby Malkin era that they said, this is the guy who is going to be the long-term winger for Sid. He's going to be the long-term winger for Malkin. And there is just a wake of players who did not work. And it's because they weren't bad players. They just didn't have the hockey sense to work with elite players. Both Koivunen and McGroarty early on seemed to have that. The assist on Sid's goal against Dallas, that is a difficult pass to make, and it's to a player who makes plays that the average player cannot. So being able to put those together and keep up with that and have that hockey IQ is a skill in of itself. One of people's favorite Penguins, mine included, is the legend Phil Kessel. And Phil Kessel didn't really work with Sidney Crosby, didn't really work with Evgeny Malkin, ended up working with Malkin near the end on the second Stanley Cup run, but that was more out of necessity than anything. But Phil Kessel was the kind of player who needed the puck on his stick at all times. He had to shoot. He had to be the trigger man. That doesn't really work with Crosby or Malkin. Even though they're not trigger men themselves, they are both the goal scorer and the playmaker. You just have to know when that moment comes. Gensel could do that. Chris Kunitz could do that. Brian Rust can do that. And I think if they continue to develop the way they are, Koivunen and McGroarty can be the next two guys for the last leg of these two's career to be that guy who knows this is the moment where he's going to set me up for a goal, or this is the moment where I need to get the puck over to him. And this is the last thing I want to say about these two that has really impressed me is in their time, it's been very limited for Koivunen with Malkin, but it's been a nice little run for Rutger McGroarty with Sidney Crosby. They're not deferring to the big guys. They're not just thinking, okay, I'm going to give the puck to Sid or Gino and get the hell out of the way. They are knowing when they need to get the puck to them and when they can take the puck themselves.
Yeah, and that's a big, honestly, a big developmental step for a lot of young players coming through the system. Because, look, I mean, face it, Ville Koivunen was literally asked at the beginning, when he was first called up, what would be his dream line. He was like, me, Sid, and Gino. Like, these guys are aware of the type of talent that they're playing with. They're aware that they're playing with all-time great players. And any, young player that I've spoken to that's come to the organization in any capacity this season has pretty much said the same thing. I mean, there's a little bit of that starstruckness that they kind of have to get over the hump a little bit before things just start gelling naturally. And I'm not really seeing that with them. It's not like they're not, as you said, they're not deferring at all. They're playing fearless. And that's something that is a really good sign for young players that are coming in and playing with guys like Sidney Crosby and Evgeny Malkin, because that can be very easily intimidating for players in that position. And to see them just, playing their game and not kind of sitting back waiting for Sid to make something happen or waiting for Gino to make something happen. They're playing to their strengths, and it's playing off of those two guys really well. Because, I mean, even in the short sample that we've seen Koivunen with Malkin, I really like how their skill sets are marrying as well. I think Koivunen's creativity and vision works well with Malkin's playmaking ability and also Malkin's vision. So, it's a good thing to see from these two guys in particular. And like I said, we'll see how the rest of these prospects kind of figure in over the next couple seasons, and if they can really, find a spark with some of these veterans that are already on the roster. And that kind of takes us to, I think, our last thing that we want to talk about. Obviously, we're going to have all summer long to talk about the summer. And let's make no mistake. I mean, this is a pretty big summer for the Penguins, no matter how you slice it. I think that there's, a lot of different ways that they could go this summer in terms of roster construction. In terms of what they decide to do in both the restricted free agent market and the unrestricted free agent market, the trade market, offer sheet market, the draft, obviously. So, Pat, I just want to kind of get your thoughts on something here because, with seeing how NHL ready Rutger, McGroarty, and Ville Koivunen seem to be, and I think Josh Yohe wrote a nice piece on this yesterday. And I actually have a piece that I'm releasing later today that's kind of similar in a few regards. But, we see how, and we forgot to mention Ovi broke the goal record Sunday. If you've been living under a rock and haven't been paying attention, congrats to Ovi. But, I'm watching Ovi break this record. And I think part of what made it so much more meaningful is that the Capitals are playing meaningful games. I mean, and you could kind of go back, through this season with the Capitals. You could argue the merits of whether the great chase has kind of elevated this team to be a little bit more than it actually is. But I'm watching this and I'm just sitting there, thinking, man, like I go back to when Sid broke his record and a 7-3 thrashing by the Buffalo Sabres, and he was just dejected in his locker stall after the game, couldn't enjoy the moment. Beyond nostalgia and beyond just doing this for Sid, Josh Yohe made a great point that, it's not like Sid's declining, and it doesn't seem to be one of those situations where you're seeing an aging player that's going to start declining. I mean, Sid is playing like he's 27. And if you're Kyle Dubas, does that kind of change your approach a little bit this summer? And especially considering that you have a couple prospects that are maybe more NHL ready than you thought they would be at this point.
Well, here's the funny thing about it. I don't think it has to change the calculus totally. They're trying to do what the Capitals did a couple of years ago. I've written about this. I've talked about it on Locked On Penguins. The biggest risk of what the Penguins are doing is that they're doing what the Capitals did a couple of years ago. The Capitals identified, okay, here are the guys we want to keep. Obviously, Alex Ovechkin, John Carlson, and then they get a little bit of help because Nicholas Backstrom and TJ Oshie, unfortunately, are never going to be able to play again. So they get the LTIR relief of nearly $15 million against the salary cap. But realistically, if you look at those two, they were in decline. They were still serviceable. I'm not going to go so far as to say they were cooked or they were bad, but they weren't what they were 5 to 10 years ago when the Caps were winning President's trophies and winning the Stanley Cup. But for the Penguins, if you compare what they're trying to do now, it's what the Capitals did. They're not trying to go for it. They're not making big splash signings. They're not making big flashy trades. They're stockpiling prospects. They're stockpiling draft picks. They're identifying players who can bring them those same things. So then when you get into the Capitals side of it with the great chase, which congratulations to Ovi, had to score all those goals on a real goaltender. I will have that discussion on a much later day over the summer on either here or some other podcast. But then you go look at the Capitals season so far. It's being powered by younger guys and younger prospects and second chance guys. Dylan Strome leads the team in points. He's got 76. Ovi's right behind him with 69. But then behind that, it's Alexei Protas, PLD, Connor McMichael, Jacob Chikrin. So this is what the Penguins are doing. So I don't think it has to totally change the calculus. Now, what I do think they need to do, and I think it's what they will do this summer, They've got 30 draft picks over the next 3 years. They are not going to make 30 draft picks over the next 3 drafts. They need to identify a player or two on a team that, whether it's a team like Buffalo who can't figure it out, or if it's a Western Conference team that might get a little bit desperate or doesn't like a certain player that has potential, identify those guys and bring them in using the draft capital that you have. And I'm still of the belief that the seal was broken last summer when St. Louis made the 2 offer sheets against the Oilers. I think this is going to be something we see for a while, that teams aren't going to be afraid to offer sheet good players anymore. And when you combined a solid amount of cap space, when you look at where the Penguins are going into next season with cap space, they're pretty well set up. They are going to have quite a bit of money to work with and nobody really to re-sign. So they have the cap space, they have the draft capital that they can take that next step. It doesn't mean you have to go out and sign Mitch Marner if he makes it to free agency, which I don't think he will, but you don't need to go crazy here. You have some young guys who have shown they're ready to take the next step. You find that second chance player, you find your version of Pierre-Luc Dubois or Jacob Chikrin or Dylan Strome. And I said it on our show the other day. I'm not going to delude myself and say that they'll become like the Capitals next year and make a run for the President's Trophy and look like a contender, but getting back into the playoffs and maybe fighting for a second or third seed in the Metro, they play their cards right. I don't see a Sid decline coming. And to continue that little bit about the Capitals, John Carlson is one of the guys who's been around forever. He's got all of 50 points. That's not what you would expect from John Carlson in his prime. But 50 points from John Carlson while you have 6 players producing better than him, kind of feeling like that's Evgeny Malkin. You get 55, 60 points out of Gino in his last year. You got 5 or 6 young guys who can pick it up and pick up the slack, and Sid continues to be Sid. This could be a good team next year.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I divert a little bit, and I'll get to that in a second. But I do think, as I'm looking at how this team is currently constructed, and just like I said, just the emergence of Ville, Koivunen, and Rutger McGroarty, all the things you said about restricted free agency, offer sheets, and you brought up something that's kind of a sticking point that people might be overlooking. And I think this is going to really play into roster construction over the next 3 years. The cap is going up like significantly. And the Penguins are in a really unique situation because, as you said, they have no obligations to long-term extensions on the roster. Everybody that they expect or they need locked up is already locked up. They don't have to worry about guys like McGroarty and Koivunen for another 2 years until those extension talks even kick in. They're in a good spot as far as cap space, and kind of an advantageous spot because it allows them to get really creative in terms of how they allocate that cap space. Now, I see a lot of people, saying, hey, you got to offload Jari, you got to offload Graves, you got to find a way to offload some of these bad contracts. But, while roster-wise, that might be the case to some extent, in terms of cap, I mean, I don't necessarily think that's a necessary step because all that cap is free cap. So if you're looking at the restricted free agent market, if you're looking at offer sheets, the Penguins are going to be able to offer, to an extent that some other teams might not be able to. And even if you're looking at unrestricted free agency, now this is where I divert a little bit. I'm not saying Penguins go after Mitch Marner. I wouldn't be against it. But if we're being realistic here, I guess more realistic, I wouldn't rule out them going after somebody like a Brock Besser or somebody in that kind of, ilk, because another thing to consider here is free agents are going to only get more and more and more expensive as with each passing season. So if there's somebody out there this season that they like and they figure can be part of their, rebuild effort and their contention window, it might be best to get a jump on, that guy and sign them now while the price is still where it is. And kind of get a jump on that. Because the other part of this too, I hear the tank brigade, guys. I hear all the Gavin McKenna truthers out there. There's a generational talent waiting in the wings for the next draft. But if you look at this situation realistically, even if the Penguins don't try to be good next year, I just don't see a world where they're bad enough, or at least as bad as those bottom Western teams, to really have a realistic run at getting Gavin McKenna. And even if they go 0-82 next season, because of the way the draft lottery works, that's not even a guarantee. So I think they're in this unique position where they have a lot of flexibility to kind of do what they want at will. They have the assets, they have the cap space, and they also have, a collection of veterans on their roster that are still playing at a pretty high level. You marry all of those things and they can realistically be what the Capitals were maybe 2 seasons ago when they squeaked into the playoffs, maybe weren't quite supposed to be there, but they had the foundation in place with those younger players, and then they took the next step this past season. So when I think about it, I think the Penguins are almost like 2 years behind the Capitals, I would say, in their, stage, the rebuild stage. But that's kind of where I'm at. I'm open to all options this offseason.
Obviously, this is going to change between now and then. But as we record this on Wednesday, April 9th, 2025, Sidney Crosby's final season on his extension. Now, we don't know if that will be his final season playing, but it's when his extension ends. Going into that season right now, when you go to Puckpedia, the Penguins have nearly $55 million in salary cap space available. So, and to your point about tanking and the draft, listen, I have already felt the internet's wrath about this because I did it on our show weeks ago where I said I am anti-tanking, especially right now, because I just think you look at Chicago, you look at Buffalo. I will exclude San Jose because they're figuring it out and they're about to take another step because all of their young guys are coming up. But it's a stench on your organization that takes a while to get off because you have kind of accepted and embraced mediocrity in losing, and that takes a while to get out of. But at the end of the day, the reason and like you, if the Penguins on July 1 find out Mitch Marner is not re-signing with the Toronto Maple Leafs and Kyle Dubas can go get his old pal and make him a Penguin, you're not going to see me turn on the microphone for Locked On Penguins and call it a stupid move because he's a genuinely great hockey player. He would immediately take this team to another level. But you look at the Penguins cap projection, it's only about $24.5 million in space next season going into next season. So you figure he's going to eat a significant chunk of that, 12 to 13 on that. And when you're looking for some reclamation projects, when you're looking to make some of the trades that I think that they're going to make this summer, you're probably going to have to take on some anchor contracts. It's probably going to be similar in a way to, and this obviously isn't a one-for-one comparison, the Kevin Hayes deal. Kevin Hayes has worked out. I think he's been solid, but his salary's a little heavy, and they were trying to get draft picks. So to get the draft pick they wanted, they had to take Kevin Hayes on. That's going to get a little bit more difficult over the next couple years because they're going to try to get young reclamation projects. They're going to try to get good draft capital. They're going to try to get good prospects. And there's going to be teams who say, okay, we'll give you that, but you've got a bunch of cap space. You're going to have to take this guy who makes $5, $6, maybe $7 million for the next year in order for us to make that deal with you. So I'm not against the idea of them getting him, but I think it would technically kind of get in the way of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, I would generally agree. And I think, it's a very hypothetical situation. It was just put out into the universe with Mitch Marner. But hypothetically, in that situation, I do think that they would somehow have to find a way to offload some salary on the roster, whether that's trading Erik Karlsson or, trading Jari somehow, even though I have high doubts that that's possible at this point without giving up a significant asset. You know, Something else I think too, and something that's interesting about the Capitals situation and in relation to the tanking, discourse is if you look at what the Capitals have done, it's been all about drafting and development and scouting. If you look at they've held on to some picks since about 2019. But the only top 10 pick they've had in that time span was in 2023, when they drafted Ryan Leonard. So that was 8th overall, which is about where the Penguins should be this season. It's teams are figuring out different ways to construct rosters in order to build a competitive roster. Because we've seen, you named a couple examples of some of these teams that are just perpetually rebuilding. And we didn't even mention Detroit. We didn't mention, some of these other teams that have been kind of in this weird limbo state for years because they can't quite get over the hump. They've developed that losing culture, and, it's tough to get out of that. So teams are figuring out creative ways to build rosters, and I think that's going to be more of a prevalent thing the more the cap goes up. I think you're going to see the NHL kind of transform into not necessarily the state of other, major professional sports leagues where teams can pretty much buy championships, but it's going to be a little bit more similar in the regard that yes, they can buy some of those key pieces to make themselves contenders or to accelerate that process. So I think it's going to be interesting to see how Dubas allocates this free cap space he has. Because like I said, especially since they don't have obligations to anybody on their current roster, I think it makes for an interesting situation. But we'll see what happens. Is there anything else you want to add?
No, I mean, I think I'll end with this kind of where we were in the middle of the show. I think this last week has been the exact thing that the doctor ordered for the Pittsburgh Penguins organization, because you knew that this team wasn't going to make the playoffs by about mid-season. You knew they weren't going to be a playoff team again. And it's really easy after 20 years of going for it to get a little impatient and to think it's over, it's time to tank. But then you started to see some of the fruits of the labor that has gone in the last couple of years. Rutger McGroarty looks like he's going to be an NHL player. Ville Koivunen looks like he's going to be an NHL player. Then you couple it with everything that we just talked about, the amount of draft picks, the number of prospects, the amount of cap space, and you can really see a world where this might just be a blip on the radar. It's not going to be the golden era again. We're not going to be among contenders for a decade to 15 years, but they're not going to be a basement team for a long time. This could be over as soon as next year, or it could be 2 seasons from now. Suddenly they're right back in the mix. So at the end of the day, I think Kyle Dubas correctly identified that it was time to do this, and maybe it was a season too late, but at the end of the day, we're not going to have prolonged pain in Pittsburgh when it comes to the Penguins.
I would have to agree with you there. I don't think this is going to take as long as some people think it might take. And just as a final point here, I think another thing too, and we talked about how, rosters are starting to be constructed differently in the modern day NHL, and, GMs figuring out more creative ways for roster construction. I think it also speaks to this idea that, there might be shorter windows for these kinds of things, but if you can have more shorter windows, more of those in quantity, as opposed to, rebuilding for 6 to 10 years sometimes. If you can have a couple quick windows within that time, maybe there's the same chance at success as there would be doing it the other way around. Because it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the Capitals once Tom Wilson, once Ovi hangs them up. Because I think they're gonna be in a weird spot. Obviously, they'll have some cap space to work with, and they have a good young foundation. But if they end up winning this season, or if they end up winning the Stanley Cup next season, I mean, that's the degree of success that you need to be able to judge it as success. So, it'll be interesting. I'm curious to see, what happens with the Capitals this season, and where they are the next couple of years, especially once Ovi retires. But like you said, I don't think the dark years are upon us yet in Pittsburgh. I think that's still a little ways off, probably when 87 hangs them up. So we'll see. But Pat, want to give everybody just a reminder of where they can find you, what you're working on, anything you want to pitch?
Yeah, like you've said, you can find me Monday through Friday on the Locked On Penguins podcast. That's everywhere you get podcasts: Spotify, Apple, YouTube. I think we're on the Roku channel at this point. I haven't seen if it's made an appearance yet since I switched over to Fubo TV, but I know there's a Locked On channel there, so we might pop up on there every once in a while. I have a Substack, Patrick on Puck. I write there about whether it's the Penguins. Yes, you can all make fun of me, WWE as well. And I'm on Blue Sky at Synonym for Wet. Same name on TikTok, same name on Instagram. You can find me across all of those. And Kelsey, we need to continue doing this more often, whether it's you coming on Locked On or me coming on here, because I think we said, oh, what are we going to do? 30, 35 minutes. Here we are almost an hour later, still talking puck, because it's always easy and it's always fun.
Absolutely. And, you're welcome back on anytime. And I'm always willing to help you guys out as well. So you just let me know. And we love having you here. So
absolutely.
Same with you and Hunter. So thanks, guys. Thanks for giving us a listen. As a reminder, we come at you every single Wednesday. But in the meantime, enjoy your week and stay out of trouble in that.